I'm going to start by just marking out where I want the join from the head and the beak to be, so that I know that I've got plenty of space in my canvas to fit the beak in. So sketch out slowly and just keep moving things around to be sure that you're going to fit everything in and you get it to the size that you want for the paper or canvas that you're working on. So the beak actually takes up quite a large proportion of the bird. In fact, it's almost double the size of the head. So I've just sketched out a sort of curve for the top of the beak and a straight line for the bottom, and then I'm just working out the size of the head, just seeing if I can get it to be the right sort of size in comparison to the beak. So just move your lines around, take a look at where the eye would go and the little white bib, and just lightly sketch everything in. Drawing in the black shapes and lines on the beak will help you just to divide the upper and lower parts of the beak, which are not exactly half. The lower beak's a little bit smaller. So putting in those bits of pattern or black stripes and shapes on there will just help. It's almost a straight line to divide the two parts of the beak out. Just go around, take your time, check your shapes, check the proportions of the head to the beak, sketching out, if you like, the twig or branch I should say that's in front of the bird. Put in a few more of the details, maybe just the orange shape around the eye, the eyeball, just lightly. And think about whether you want to include details like the claws on the branch, the leaf that's in the foreground. Decide what you want to leave out, what details you want to draw in. And then when you've finished your drawing, just lightly erase your lines so that you don't end up with a really heavy outline showing through your pastel. So take your time with this. Hit the pause button just now and take your time to draw out, because it's worth getting a drawing you're happy with before you start on the colour. Once you've got a drawing that you're happy with, just erase that line at the white bib so you definitely don't have a dark outline at that point. And we're ready to start with our pastels. So we're going to start with the background, and I'm going to look at the photograph but not exactly copy every part of it. I'm going to start with the really bright green pastel because I want my background to be really strong, vibrant and colourful. And I'm going to put the pastel not right to the very, very edge of my drawing, because it's very hard with the chunky tip of the pastel to get close to that line. So I'm leaving a little bit of a space, just a very small space around my drawing, and I'll fill that when I start to put the Zest-it onto the pastels. So I'm just looking at leaving some areas of light, which will be the sort of dappled light on the leaves in the background, which are all very soft and out of focus, helping all the attention to be on the toucan and not on the background. And then I'm just filling in some of the areas of green, looking at the photograph, but also thinking about where I'd like to put some of the colour. So I'm going to put some colour in front of that white part of the bird so that it stands out a little bit more and doesn't get lost into the white of the background. So you can make some decisions on where to put the green. Think about just some circular or oval or sort of shapes of white that you might have as the light reflects off some of the leaves. But you can also just kind of let this grow and evolve just as you start to put the green pastel down. So just enjoy placing some areas of green, leaving some areas of white, looking at your image, referring to your image, and then just making decisions on whether you want to add more green or not. So I'm depositing quite a bit of pastel down, but the canvas, or if you're using a textured paper, that will still show through. You don't have to put so much pastel down that you completely cover the white. In fact, that will probably be too much pastel for when you add the Zest-it on. And you'll get the feel for that once you start to have a go at that. So I'm layering a bit down, but I'm not putting it on really, really thickly. It's easier to add more pastel if you need it as well. So I think I will now start to add in some more variation into the greens in my background, picking out the most vibrant of the darker greens, although depending on what effect you want, you could use any darker or lighter colours. And I'm going to use the yellow because I know the yellow is going to make my green really bright, really stand out a lot. So if you don't want your green to be quite so bright, then maybe yellow won't work. You can make your own decisions on how you'd like the background to be, whether a little bit duller, softer, more muted, or really bright and vibrant. So I'm adding some yellow just into some of the areas that I think will be the lighter parts of the background. So around the edges of some of the white, sort of sunlight reflections. And then building a bit more green onto areas as well. So anywhere that you think perhaps you haven't got enough pastel down, if it's just a very, very light amount of pastel, it might not be enough for when you start to put the Zest-it on. You can build more green over the top. So go backwards and forwards with your different colours. So thinking about where to put the darkest parts of the greens, and I'm looking at the photo a little bit as well and seeing some darker greens in the corners, maybe a little bit more of a line where there's perhaps a leaf. And I can overlap some of the light green that I've already got there, and I can put the green directly onto the white canvas or white paper if that's what you're working on. And you can build the two together if you want to create a softer effect. So just add the greens however you feel. Just enjoy putting the pastels down, building up the colours, but don't feel that you've got to cover the white of the paper. You don't need to put a thick layer of oil pastel onto your paper or canvas. And you don't need to go really close to your bird. You can leave a little bit of a light border and know that you're going to fill that in when you put the Zest-it on top of the pastels. Nothing needs to be perfectly blended either, because all of the blending of colours happens when you put the Zest-it on. So it's fine for it to be quite uneven, quite patchy. It's a very different way of working with pastels when you know you're going to apply the mineral spirits over the top, because that's when it does all of the mixing and blending. Once you've done this once, you will be very confident on what this is that you're doing. I'm just making some decisions about how much light I want, how much white I want in the background, and whether I want to fill in some of those white spaces a bit more. I'm just putting in some patches of stronger greens into some of the corners where there's some darker spots in the photograph as well. But all of the time my pressure on pastel is very light. Just thinking about making a little bit more interest in these white shapes. I'm just making this up really, just going with what I feel, so having a few little white light, bits of circular light, changing my greens so there's a bit of variation in the light and dark greens. And there really is no right or wrong to this. You can just make a judgment on how much of each green you'd like, and you can add darker greens, as I said. If you want a little bit more of the sort of light white shapes, then have more of those. So I think that I've pretty much got what I'm happy with. I've got enough pastel down that it will work with the Zest-it. It's not too light a layer and it's not too heavy. And I'm happy enough with the white spaces that I've left. So I think that I'm now ready to go on with the Zest-it. So if you want to carry on with your pastels, just hit the pause button. And if you're ready to move on, we'll get the Zest-it out. So you can use any odourless mineral spirit, and Zest-it is recommended for this technique with oil pastels, but anything similar will work. So I've just decanted some into a little glass jar, which means that I can put a lid on it as well and keep it. And I've got some kitchen paper here so that I can dab my brush if I need to. So it's important that you start here with the lightest parts, and I'm just taking some of those light areas and just moving some of the oil pastel around the edges and softening those edges. Taking a small bit of Zest-it and just turning that oil pastel from pastel into a sort of painted look. So start with the light areas because it's very, very easy to drag the dark pastel into the light areas, and then you'll lose what you wanted to keep light. And you'll just need to keep getting a little bit of the Zest-it on your brush, and you can see that it's fine to leave a little gap around your drawing because it's very easy to fill that in when you start to move the pastel around and it becomes liquid. So I could have put white oil pastel into these white areas and that would have helped a bit with the blending, but I can also just soften the edges of my pastel and blend them into the white of the canvas, and you could do the same on your paper. So I'm actually just putting a little bit of Zest-it onto the white areas first of all, and it stays wet for quite a long time so that I can then move some of the pastel into the white areas if I want to, and I can control whether I want it to stay completely white or whether I want to just put a lighter green on. So you'll quickly get the feel for just how much Zest-it you need on your brush, and I would always say less, and then you can always get more if you need it, and how you can use your brush just to change your pastel into a liquid, and then you can blend the colours really easily. But I always start with the light areas and start to blend the light into the dark. And the kitchen paper is really useful for just making sure that my brush is clean, so that if I've got some dark colour on my brush, dip it in the Zest-it and just give it a little clean on the kitchen paper just before, so that I know that I'm not going to put a colour where I don't want it to be because it's left on the brush. So a small bit of care as you get close to your bird drawing, and you just move that pastel right up to your line. And just moving a pastel around. So once it becomes liquid, once it becomes like a paint, you can move it around on your canvas or your paper quite easily, and just very carefully think about how you might move dark into light or light into dark. And a small amount of the Zest-it just on the tip of your brush is probably easier to control than flooding your paper or canvas with a lot of the liquid. And you'll see it becomes like painting. So this is a great way to get started in painting. If you're not confident at mixing colours, if you want your colours to stay really bright and vibrant, and colour mixing can sometimes lead to quite muddy, dirty colours, this is a great way to quickly as well get a painting. So just enjoy transforming those pastels into paint, moving them around, deciding on light areas, dark areas, mixing the colours, letting them blend together, and just gradually working from your lighter greens into your darker ones. So I'm just enjoying gradually building in the Zest-it into my pastels. But if you're finished, then just fast forward ahead to the next part where we will start to put the colour onto the bird. But just take your time with this. It's really an enjoyable process, and you can add more pastel on top if you feel like it's too thin a coat. You need to put more pastel on top. Just you can either let it dry and do that, or you can also do it while it's wet as well. So it's a good idea to let this dry a little bit, only because you might end up leaning your hand or putting your fingers into the wet green pastel. So if you're careful, you can continue as it is. And we're going to start with the beak of the bird. So I'm going to pick out some nice bright yellows and oranges, and also a couple of reds, because there are some dark and middle red tones on the beak as well. And actually, to make the beak even a little bit brighter and a little bit more vibrant, I could use that very, very bright yellow that we used for the background as well. You might find this is a little bit too bright for you, but you can always start with it and then add some darker, more orangey yellows over the top. So starting with the light colours is always a bit easier. And I'm just looking at the shapes on the beak, the darker yellows and oranges as well, and then darker colours on the bottom of the beak. So we'll put in the different shades of yellow first. I'm just leaving a very small gap at the top because there's a stripe of red just at the top of the beak, and obviously the yellow will affect that red if it mixes in with the Zest-it. So I'm just leaving a little gap there. I'm going to start to fill in those yellows and oranges. So I'm just building those two yellows together so it will be quite bright. And I'm not worrying too much again about getting too close to, some of the black patterns and stripes on the beak, because I know I can move my pastel around when I put the Zest-it on. So the background should have given you a bit of confidence as to how much pastel you need to put down so that it's not too thin when you put the Zest-it on. And I'm just gradually working through some yellows, orangey yellows, and then we'll put some reds on as well. So I'm just keeping looking at the image, just looking at where to put in the different shades of yellows and oranges. It's a bit darker on the bottom of the beak. In fact, it goes very dark near the bottom, so I'm going to use some of my oranges and reds here. And again, hardly any pressure with the pastel because I'm using a canvas, and if you're using a textured paper the same will apply. That will pick up quite a lot of the pastel because of the roughness of the texture. And I know I'm going to do a lot of blending with the Zest-it, so I'm just thinking about colour really and matching the colours up a bit. So really just take your time with this. Spend a good bit of time looking as well at the image you've got. Putting a little bit of orange around the eyes, and again, I'm not worried too much about getting right up to the lines of my drawing because I know I can do that with my brush. I'm just thinking about the colour, so a bit of orange and a bit of yellow together I think should cover it. Strengthening that orange on the top beak a little, because there's almost a distinctive line there between the orange and the yellow. So when you're ready, just make sure that your brush is nice and clean, and just take care with your Zest-it if it's got a bit of colour in it, because you don't want to put any green onto your beak. And I'm using a slightly smaller brush now, which is going to help me just have a little bit of control. And just gradually turning that pastel into paint. And use your tissue or kitchen paper to help you keep your brush clean. If you know that you're going back to a light colour from a darker one, just clean your brush a little. Just take care to carefully build your Zest-it into your pastel. Just looking at trying to add that orange, darker orange to the top of the beak. And it might be that I need to just let that dry a little bit, and then I'll go back in with my orange pastel and put a little bit more on there. So don't worry if things are not exactly how you want them to be. You can go back with your pastel again and add more. Just looking at that very small little bit of hook just to the edge of the beak there. Some of those small little details can help. And take a lot of care that you don't mix your pastels, so that's why it's a good idea to let your green background dry a little as well, because if you mix your red and green together you'll get brown, which is not necessarily the colour that you want. So just some care as you go from the foreground of the bird to the background. So the brush is great for putting this detail around the eye. If you've got a brush with a reasonably good point to it. So I'm going to put that very dark line along the top of the beak, so I have to use the edge of my pastel just to get as thin a line as I can. And put down a reasonable amount of pastel so that I know that I can get a nice strong red when I add the Zest-it. I'm using my darkest red for this, and then just a bit more of the other red over the top. And you know you can move things around a little with the Zest-it too. So I'm putting a little bit more of those kind of lines and patterns that are on the bottom of the beak. Just kind of going roughly where those might be with my pastel, and then I know I can do a lot more work with my brush. And just looking at putting a little bit more of a stronger orange as well onto the beak. making sure my brush is nice and clean. And then I'm going to just use a little bit of red just to show the line between the upper and lower parts of the beak. Keeping it quite subtle though. And then have a little look at some of those interesting lines and marks. And just moving that dark red around a little bit, knowing that it's staying on my brush. So I can create quite a subtle effect then by just picking up some of the red on my brush, putting in some of those lines and moving the pastel around that way. So just have fun with this, really look at the image and then make your own interpretation of the marks and lines that you can see. So I'm going to leave the beak there for now and let it dry a little bit and go to the dark areas on the bird. So I'm going to use the white this time because I want to create some greys as well, so mixing my black, grey and white together. So looking at some of the lighter areas, obviously on the bib or the front of the bird's head, but also within the areas that you might think of as black. It's much easier to build up into the darker, so start lighter and then you can gradually add darker colours or tones to the bird. So the black can be quite strong, so I'm going to also put a bit of grey in, and it might be that I end up putting much more black on, but I'm going to be a little bit cautious and put some greys on as well, which I will mix in, blend in with the black. So particularly the bits that are on the beak are probably not a really pure black at all. So a little bit of grey might help a little bit just to soften that harsh darkness, and a little bit on the feathers as well. But just have a look at the photograph and make your own decisions on how you might like to add some variation into the black parts of the bird and also into that white part as well. Just putting some bits of grey in there, which I know I can mix in with my Zest-it. And with the black, you don't have to put quite as much pastel down because it's so strong. So you can layer it even a little bit more lightly, putting less pastel onto your paper or canvas, and still get quite a dark black paint effect. So start with less, it's easy to put more down if you need it. And I'm not going to put the leaf into this foreground because I'm going to show you how you can use a little bit of the pastel as almost like a palette. So I'm going to use this corner for that, just for demonstration purposes, but you might have a leaf in this part here, which is quite a nice part of the composition. So I'm putting a bit more pastel down here because I'm going to use this to pick up some black on my brush when I need it as well. So, like before, you don't need to go right up to the lines of any part of your drawing. I think I'm going to put a little bit of blue, maybe a lighter blue. I'm using one that's a little bit darker. There's a slight blue sort of hint on that coloured part of the beak there. So you can make really subtle effects with colour as well. If you want to add a little bit of a colour into your black, you can do a bit of a blue or even a bit of a green or something, or a purple, to create a little bit of a colour within it. That can work really nicely. So when you're ready to go on with Zest-it, just do so. Just make sure that, again, it's nice and clean. And you'll see that the black can be quite strong. And make good use of the tissue or paper that you've got. If you've got too much of a pastel colour on your brush, just give it a wipe on the tissue, and that helps just to control what you're doing and what you're moving around. And again, just take care, use the very tip of your brush, a very small amount of Zest-it when you've got bits that are quite detailed, or you've got, I don't want to move the black on top of the yellow or the red. Nice and slow, there's no rush with this. As you move on to the light areas again, just make sure your brush has got the right amount of grey or black on it, just so you don't end up putting a dark colour where you don't want it to be. And you've got your white pastel there that you can use to your effect to fill in and blend with the greys to create the shadows under the beak and the very small amounts of shadow there are on top of the white. And you'll see just how strong the black is, even with a very, very light layer. And it's very easy, if you feel like it's too thin a layer of black and it's too watery, it's easy to add more oil pastel over the top. So don't worry about that. Just see where you are with it first of all, and decide if you want to build more on top. So because I've got some white oil pastel here and some grey, it's nice and light. It gives me a bit of control, and I'm able to just decide exactly how black I want my black to be. So because my green background's dry enough, I can just take some of that black oil pastel and just move it to the edges with the tip of my brush to create a nice little feathered effect, just where I can see it in the image. Gives them a bit of character. So there's a good well of black here that is just going to be quite a flat black tone. And I'm going to use that to pick up some of the black onto my paintbrush and use that for places where I want to put in a very small amount of darker detail. And if you feel like you've got too much on your brush, just to give it a little clean, a little dry on your tissue. And that way you can move around your colours. And even though my Zest-it's quite wet, I can still put more black onto it, just to make this area a bit darker. Just wipe off any Zest-it that sits on the pastel. So I'm going to turn my attention to the eyes. There's a nice sort of blue, which I'm going to just dot with my pastel because I know I can fill in all the details with the brush. So I'm just dotting a bit of the blue around, enough that I can turn it into paint. I'm going to put a couple of different shades of blue on a slightly darker one. Just looking at the image, putting some darker spots around the edges. Just using this very light blue as well, just to give some light parts too. We'll see how it looks once I put the Zest-it on. Got quite a lot of black on my brush, so I'll just clean that off so it's nice and clean before I go into the blue. Making sure I've not got too much Zest-it on my brush as well, because this is just a small area. And I'm just cleaning my brush now and again, just so that I don't move the light blue into the dark or the dark blue onto the light and lose anything that I've just put down with my bits of pastel. Just the tip of the brush touching the paper. Just slowly turning that pastel into paint. So rather than trying to put the black pastel onto the eye, I'm just putting some into that little corner, and I'm going to use that to paint the eye in. So I can see that I've got some on my brush. Putting a little bit of a line, very fine. And then I'm going to look for those highlights as well in the eye. Try and leave some of those highlights if I can. But don't worry if you don't, I'll show you how you can add them at the end as well. So I'll leave some little white dots, which is just a little bits of light reflection on the eye. And this is what gives him his lovely thoughtful look. He's sort of staring wistfully. So I've left a little bit of highlight there, but don't worry if you filled it black. I'll show you how to add more once it's a bit drier as well. So the beak's going to be a bit drier now, so I'm just going to put in a little bit more of that orange kind of stripy part, just to make a bit more definition there. And it helps that it's just a little bit drier now, although it's not fully dry at all, that I can put this orange in. So it's really easy to go back and move around and add bits and take a step back from your painting every now and again and just look for bits that you want to change or move around, make the colours a bit stronger. I'm just fading that orange into the yellow, making sure my brush has not got too much orange on it as I sort of move it up into the yellow part. Once you've got your toucan to kind of where you want it to be, the last thing to do is the branch. And you might have your leaf in the foreground, which you can obviously decide how you want to deal with that. And also think about what you want to do with the branch, which is out of focus in the photograph, and I think you want your toucan to be your main focus, so I would just add the branch in quite softly as well. I'm going to use the darkest brown. Much like the leaves in the background, I would just let you decide how you want to add a little bit of pattern or texture into your branch, and just build it up gradually and slowly. Keep on sort of taking a look at it as a whole and just seeing how it works alongside your toucan, and whether you want to make it darker, whether you want to add more detail into it. So I'm generally looking at the photo, although I don't think there's a lot in there. Looking at what I've got in terms of colour, and actually this slight peach tone might be quite useful. I'm using a bit of white as well. Just want to be careful with this yellow because I don't want it to be too yellowy, because I want the beak to be the thing that stands out as being quite bright. I want to keep this bit of branch quite soft. And the best way to do it is just to start quite light, and then you can build up more and more of your darker areas of the branch. I'm just thinking about the light hitting it from the top left and where the dark tones might be. So just play about with this. Put your Zest-it on and then add more darker brown on if you need to. But don't worry about getting it to be super realistic, because as I said, you want the attention to be on your toucan, not on this branch. So keep it all very loose and soft. Just enjoy sort of playing about with adding in the colours and textures. I think I've lost a little bit of my highlights in the lighter areas and the textured parts. I can actually use my white pastel and almost like scratch into or work into the wet Zest-it. So you can put light on top of dark in this way, especially if you've got something textured. This is a great technique to use as well. So I'm just going to put some more light textures on. And I also need a bit more dark on the other side of the branch as well. And this is the darkest brown I have. So it may be that I want to add just a touch of black in as well. I'm just going to make use of this black and put it onto my brush rather than use the black pastel, which might just be a bit too strong. Just to put some darker bits in to my brown, just to make my brown a little bit darker and to create a little bit of texture. Just dabbing and working in a more painterly way, I guess. So just enjoy this part. There's no right or wrong with this, just think about where the light is, where the dark is. And just play around with this. And when you're finished, just fast forward to the end. But take your time and just enjoy this painterly way of using the pastels. So to put a few more highlights into the eyes, if you painted them a little bit too dark, just with your very clean oil pastel, just twist a little bit to make some little dots of white, and they'll show up on top of the black, and then you can control or sort of paint round to make those the shape you want by just picking up a bit more black from a section or off a piece of scrap if you need to. and just painting around those white dots to get the shape and size you want them to be. So don't worry if you put too much white pastel down, you can paint around it with the black pastel again. And those little small details in the eye really help to give the character of the bird. So you might be done. I'm just going to fiddle a little bit, put a little bit more of a darker green into just a few spots. Just looking at the overall image and just looking at areas that I might be able to just make the birds stand out a bit more. But when you're finished, of course, just fast forward to the end. But sometimes this is the nicest part, the part where you just fiddle around with the small details. But of course, you have to make a decision on when it's finished. And it can be good just to leave your painting on a shelf and look at it again the next day and see if you can spot anything glaring that you want to fix. But usually it will be finished. So when you're done, you're done. And I'm just going to just put a little bit more of a darker green in to a couple of spots. See how it looks. So I'm at the stage now where I think that I'm happy with how I've blended those greens into the background. I'm reasonably happy with where I've put the bird and the dark and light parts of the beak and the eyes and so on. And I like the expression on his face. I like to see how yours turns out and whether you have a similar sort of look to your little bird character or whether it has a completely different look. It'll be really good to see. So share them with me if you can. And yeah, I hope you really enjoyed having a go at this painting and just taking a bit of time out. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what you've made.